Pastor and author T.D. Jakes says this about two important words, familiarity and intimacy, and that they're not the same. Each has value in life, certainly in marriage, life, but one is not a substitute for the other. If one is confused for the other, then we have the basis for major human and marital unrest. In marriage, familiarity is inescapable. It happens almost imperceptibly, he says. Intimacy is usually hard to come by. It must be deliberately sought and opened up and responded to. Familiarity brings a degree of ease and comfort, but intimacy anxiously searches for deep understanding and personal appreciation. These are not words just for a marriage relationship. I think these are two words for the most important relationship, your friendship with God. Welcome to the 260 journey into Revelation 4. Familiarity and intimacy can be defined like this. Familiarity refers to knowledge, having information about someone, but there is a danger when it stops at information and when it needs to go further. When it comes to important things and people in our lives, if familiarity doesn't turn to intimacy, then we face the danger of living in a relationship of only familiarity. Have you heard of this phrase? Familiarity breeds contempt. All the information you have doesn't move you closer to the person, but a disregard of the information, that knowing stuff is just enough. See, intimacy is not for every relationship, but it must be the threshold we cross in the important relationships, especially with God. Intimacy means closeness. It's a proximity word and a conscious effort to close the gaps between us. What I mean by closing the gaps is that all mysteries and hidden things are exposed and closes the gaps. Intimacy knows the secrets and the motives of the heart. T.D. Jakes says the best way to define intimacy is into me, see. That was the invitation by God to John the Revelator. I want you to see deeper. I want you to clear up some mystery for you. And I'm inviting you to intimacy. Here's the invitation in Revelation 4, 1 and 2. After these things, I looked, and behold, a door was standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard, like the sound of a trumpet speaking with me, said, "Come up here, and I'm going to show you what must take place after these things." Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was standing in heaven, and one sitting on the throne. John knew the Jesus on earth, but intimacy calls for closing the gaps. John, you are now going to see the Jesus you've never seen before, the Jesus in heaven. You know the Jesus on the cross and the Jesus resurrected, but you've never experienced or seen the Jesus on the throne ruling the planet. I think the best New Testament word to describe intimacy with God is walking in the Spirit. To walk in the Spirit is now I am in step with God and walking in cadence with Him. Familiarity has moved to intimacy. To walk in the Spirit now brings closeness and closes the gaps. Writer Gordon MacDonald says this: there are no shortcuts, no gimmicks, no easy ways to cultivate an intimate relationship with God. Here's what happened to John. When he was in the Spirit, he saw the throne. I think that's what happens when we walk in the Spirit. We see Jesus on the throne, Jesus in charge, the Jesus that calls the shots, the sovereignty of Jesus. Why do I think this? Because of how many times throne is mentioned after he is called to come up. He was shown an open door, but was his prerogative whether he would go through it or not. That's the familiarity intimacy gap. That was the choice of moving from being familiar with Jesus to being intimate with Jesus. And when the gap was closed between John on earth and Jesus in heaven, he saw a throne. Intimacy revealed Jesus on the throne. Ready for this? The word throne is used 11 times in this short 11-verse chapter. 11 times. I think God was trying to show John something. The word in the Spirit is a familiar word in the New Testament because it's often used. Ephesians says pray in the Spirit. Philippians says worship in the Spirit. Colossians says love in the Spirit. And Galatians says walk in the Spirit. But when John was in the Spirit in Revelation 4, John saw a throne. I think whether you are praying, worshiping, or walking, you see a throne. What does that mean? I see Jesus on the throne in charge and ruling everything. He has no rivals. He is the sovereign king. When the United Nations headquarters was being built in New York City, there was some controversy as to whether a place of worship should be included in the building. One of the New York newspapers carried a cartoon depicting a huge hand. It was a picture of God's hand, and in the center of God's hand was a small globe, the world. And on top of the globe stood a group of little men from the UN in a heated argument. And the caption read at the bottom of the cartoon, "Do we have to invite him as well?" Psalm 2 says, God laughs in heaven at the arrogance of puny little sinful man. If I was the UN, I would invite him who sits on the throne. Come to think of it, if I was in Washington, D.C., in any of our universities, our public schools, I would invite him who holds the world because he sits on the throne. Washington, D.C. is just a place. Heaven has a throne. Thanks for joining the 260 Journey.